Well, good afternoon and good morning for those on, I guess, on the West Coast. As mentioned, I am David Brown. I'm a senior associate with the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. We're here, I'm welcoming you to the webinar on reducing structural barriers to school and work for people with juvenile records. And we're joined today on this workshop by Josh Weber, who is the Deputy Director of Corrections and Reentry for the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and Caitlin Dawkins, who's the Director of Juvenile Justice for FHI 360's National Institute for Work and Learning. And I'd like to thank both of them for joining us this afternoon. As many of you may know, in recent years, the Annie E. Casey Foundation has been promoting the adoption of positive youth development approaches by state and local juvenile justice systems. This has included an asset-based rather than a deficit-based approach that seeks to help young people develop positive connections and build the strength and skills of youth that have been impacted by the juvenile justice system, not simply to address their perceived deficits, really to focus on their assets. Positive youth development is reflected very prominently in our probation transformation work and in our deep end work. We have in recent years supported the development of the Reimagining Juvenile Justice training curriculum for frontline youth justice staff, which is grounded heavily in the principles and positive youth development approaches. We've also supported the National Youth Employment Coalition, which released a toolkit in December of 2020 titled Job Training for Youth with Justice Involvement, a toolkit that promotes improved collaboration between juvenile justice and the workforce development systems to both improve access to workforce development programs for youth involved in the juvenile justice system and to improve their outcomes. We can make available, we'll put the link to that tool in the chat box for those who have not yet seen that report, which came out, as I mentioned, in December. We're also currently funding a national scan of workforce development programs by the Urban Institute that seeks to identify programs that successfully serve youth who have been adjudicated for more serious and violent offenses, and that also reflect what we know about what works regarding youth development and workforce development to inform both our knowledge of best practices and promising practices in this area. So we've done a lot of work in helping to, building opportunities for young people identify efforts to help young people build the skills and capacities that will enable them to be successful in both in educational and in the workforce. However, while we can work to improve the education and workforce opportunities that are afforded to juvenile justice involved youth, the reality is that even with education and workforce skills and credentials, young adults with juvenile records are often legally precluded from occupations, from employment and educational opportunities which also significantly undermines their chances of success. So just preparing them for opportunities is not enough if we continue to have barriers in place that prevent them from entering the workforce or pursuing educational opportunities. So with that in mind, in 2020, the Casey Foundation funded the Council of State Governments Justice Center to examine this issue in several states and to develop recommendations for reducing the barriers that exist for young people. Josh Weber, as I mentioned, will share the findings and the recommendations that emerged in that report. Actually, Josh and I go way back. When I was the executive director of the National Youth Employment Coalition over 20 years ago, Josh was part of a team that completed a toolkit actually for the Casey Foundation that identified barriers and promising approaches to workforce and youth development for system-involved youth. So this is not new ground for either of us. But before we hear from Josh, we're going to hear from Caitlin Dawkins. Caitlin manages the Compass Rose Collaborative for FHI 360, a project funded by the US Department of Labor to improve the education and employment outcomes of young adults aged 18 through 24 after involvement in the US criminal justice system. Caitlin is going to draw from the experiences of young people in their 11 sites and will detail the challenges that young people with juvenile records face trying to penetrate the job market or pursue higher education. So we're going to hear from Caitlin, and then we're going to hear from Josh. So welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you, David. And I just wanted to quickly say that I'm really grateful to address all of you today, and thank you all for joining. Thank you for that nice introduction, David. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about, or what I'll be referencing today about the Compass Rose Collaborative, it is an FHI 360 led project that is funded by the Department of Labor. And we lead that as the intermediary, and we partner with community-based organizations across the nation that provide these reentry workforce programs to young adults. And I wanted to also just express my gratitude for all the young people in our programs who are very transparent and willing to share their stories with us as we really honor taking a human-centered approach to these structural barriers and including young people and their voice as we think about solutions and reducing these barriers. So if you're like me, you can only imagine being a minor and being impacted by the justice system and all that comes with it, to be young and have experienced crime or arrest, or even things like going in front of a judge, or answering to a probation officer and being under a court order. These are all things that, our young people that are in the juvenile justice system experience as part of their involvement with the justice system. And today, what we're really focusing on are those kind of additional pro-social activities that are so important. David mentioned youth development principles and a framework earlier. Those pro-social activities are so important for our young people to keep them involved in their communities, and also to keep them engaged, as well as to reduce their likelihood that they will revert back to the behaviors that may have gotten them involved in the juvenile justice system to begin with. So as we think about kind of these pro-social activities and these additional things that our youth must navigate, talking about education, post-secondary education, as well as employment, our young people and minors are really starting at the starting line of this, right? They're learning how to navigate legal systems, and at the same time, education and workforce systems. And for young people, that could be, really needing support around getting started, which could be getting a worker's permit, or even getting a state identification card, which we know that can be difficult for young people to get vital documents and get support in doing that. So I just want to, as we talk today, just think about young people from the lens of having to navigate these kind of multiple complex systems, and how it's further complicated by some of the vague language that's used in some of these applications that young people are having to complete as part of these systems. While the positive youth development framework is so important, as David mentioned, it's also really important, and something that's stressed throughout that framework is connecting young people to adults to support them through these processes. People who work in the justice system quickly find out that these people who will support young people sometimes may need to be outside of their household or their immediate family. And so what our programs at FHI 360 do is really connect young people to adults that can support them. And that may be their juvenile probation officer, it may be a mentor, or it may be a representative from a community-based organization or workforce program. But a lot of times our youth need support in navigating these systems, so we work to connect them appropriately. And I know a little bit later, Josh, in his presentation, he's going to talk about the findings of the briefing and some of the great things that are happening in addition to some of the barriers. And one of those is he's going to mention how, like, most states' juvenile justice codes do indicate that a juvenile adjudication cannot be considered a criminal conviction for most purposes. And that's great news, but there's also some really unclear and vague language around how a juvenile adjudication can be used as a barrier to impose legal barriers to work in education and on applications and what that means. It's very unclear how an employer can use this information to determine whether an applicant is a moral fit or a good fit for a position. And as a result, this really leaves employers, licensing agencies, and young people themselves really unclear about where the line is, and what can be used as a barrier or not, or what information can be received and used in making a decision on whether a young person is a good fit for a college or job. And so because these things are so vague, we've heard through conversations with young people across the nation that it can be humiliating for their past to continue to come up over and over again as they're navigating these processes and trying to move on and get their second chance. And also, in just thinking about the interview process itself, a lot of our young people have indicated that, while they're already, it may be their first interviewing experience and they're young and they're just entering the workforce, waiting on that question is almost like another layer of nervous, right? You're already nervous for a job interview, and then you're waiting on this dreaded question. And it can be a question in a variety of ways. Have you been convicted of a crime? That's a dreaded question for our young people. And a lot of times our young people have been, informed that their juvenile record and adjudications are confidential, they're private, they do not have to disclose that information. And yet, when they're sitting in front of an employer or filling out an application, there's often this dilemma because of this language on what adjudication means and what conviction means and what young people should do in this situation. And a lot of times the two choices in those dilemmas, neither of those feel right for our young people. They're left wondering, do I tell this prospective employer up front that I was adjudicated as a young person and be honest, but risk not receiving this job or this opportunity? Or do I keep this information confidential, which is my right, and risk my employer finding out later and potentially getting fired? So there's all of these things that our young people and employers and licensing agencies have to kind of navigate because the language is very unclear about where the limits are. And also speaking with youth about their experiences, they really talk about how they really want to be the person to give their own first impression. They don't want a job application to be the first impression of them. They want to get in front of an employer and be able to speak with them. And I think that's really important because a lot of our young people have gone through training programs and they've learned interviewing skills and job readiness. And so to have that opportunity to use those skills that they've used versus letting the application really dictate a first impression for an employer. One of our young people in our Compass Rose Collaborative is quoted as even saying, I want somebody to hear me out. I want them to get to know me and not get to know me by reading my file, but get to know me by asking me. So if that gives you an idea of what our young people are saying, they just want an opportunity to give their own first impression for their second chance. Also, a lot of times our young people talk about how they're able to get over some of these structural barriers and hurdles, but a lot of times it leaves them feeling as if they're running kind of this marathon and there's constant barriers and hurdles in front of them. For instance, if they're able to gain a skill or get a certification that makes them highly employable, and then they sit in front of an employer for a job and they start to get these questions, it really kind of fosters this feeling of hopelessness and like, their cards are kind of stacked against them. And that's not something we want for our youth. We don't want to have these barriers for our youth as they're trying to gain access to some of these pro-social activities like work and learning. And we also know that feeling hopeless and feeling like there's no opportunity to move on can also impact recidivism and them returning back to some of their old behaviors. The FHI 360's Compass Rose Collaborative creates opportunities for young people in the justice system and really increases access to their jobs. And we do this by really working alongside community partners and designing these kind of high demand training programs alongside of employers that are willing to hire our pipeline of these skilled talent that's ready for the workforce. We also train employers on how to foster a trauma-informed workplace and work with people who have been impacted by trauma, many of which who have gone through the justice system as well. And those strategies and that training has really helped for employers to improve their working environment for all employees. Something that we've also learned is that we really need to foster a culture of acceptance and second chances. Young people should not feel like they need to hide their past or be ashamed of their past, of things that they did when they were minors, but there needs to really be a cultural shift of acceptance and second chances. And I think through the policies and practices and some of the recommendations that Josh is going to speak about, there really is some promising opportunities for us to create additional opportunities for people with a record. I will turn it back to David.
Hold on, nice picture. I'm not sure where my video is. There it is. Thank you, Caitlin. And I'm now going to, as mentioned, turn it over to Josh Weber, who's going to talk to us about the recent report from the Council of State Government Justice Centers, and particularly focusing on the recommendations that are really highlighted in that report. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your time. I'm Josh Weber. I oversee the Juvenile Justice Program at the Council of State Government's Justice Center. Just a little bit about the Council of State Government's Justice Center, if you are unfamiliar with it. We're a national nonprofit that provides evidence-based, consensus-based advice to all branches of state government as well as local government on how to improve outcomes for youth and adults in the justice system. And our juvenile justice program, which I oversee, is really focused on helping jurisdictions to assess their policies and practices and implement research-based approaches to improve not just recidivism rates, but positive youth outcomes for youth in contact with the justice system. So a little bit about the study that we conducted. First, just a little bit of background on why it's important for juvenile justice systems to focus on reducing structural barriers. Saw in the chat that a lot of you are probation officers or service providers, and maybe typically focused on court conditions or recidivism reduction initiatives. David and Caitlin spoke a little bit about this, but why is it important for local and state juvenile justice systems to take a look at structural and policy barriers for people with a juvenile record? The first is that it affects a significant part of the population. So despite declining arrests and referrals, over 300,000 young people are adjudicated every year. And the majority of those are people of color. And those people in communities are impacted by their juvenile records potentially for their entire lives. And COVID-19 and the economic impacts of COVID-19 have been disproportionately felt by communities of color and particularly youth and young adults. So unemployment rates right now for Black youth and young adults are 16 to 17%. And we know traditionally, based on past recessions, that youth and young adult employment takes longer to bounce back than unemployment rates for pretty much every other demographic group. It's also a misnomer that, one, that people's juvenile records don't follow them, and two, that states that have sealing and expungement laws, that those address concerns about people's juvenile records. As we'll talk about in a minute, a lot of people with juvenile records are not in fact eligible for sealing and expungement, but the vast majority of people who are eligible for sealing and expungement never actually get their records cleared. Less than 10% take advantage of that opportunity within 5 years of eligibility. We also know that educational attainment and employment are critical, not just to improving lifetime earnings, but also to reducing crime. And so connecting young people and young adults who are justice involved with education and employment can be a very effective recidivism reduction strategy. It's also really important because, as Caitlin spoke to a little bit, we know from research that employers are more reluctant to hire people with a record. And that includes, research has shown, individuals whose only offenses are juvenile adjudications. And so in many ways, people with juvenile records have the deck stacked against them. We also know that it's a challenge for them to connect to continued education. So post-secondary application rates in terms of completing that application to a 2 or 4 year college or university, over 3 times higher for people with a record to not complete that application compared to people, their peers without a record. So really a stumbling block to connect with further educational opportunities. And obviously, as many of you know, a really dominant theme in juvenile justice reform over the last decade has been a developmentally appropriate approach, given that youth are not many adults. And so it's important to think differently about long-term collateral consequences for youth and young adults compared to adults, because we don't want to penalize young people for mistakes that they make in their youth for the rest of their lives in terms of their educational and employment prospects. So what did we do? We conducted a pretty unique study, really looking at state statutory and administrative barriers that specifically affect people with juvenile adjudications. And we focused in particular around education and employment related collateral consequences and those that follow people after the conclusion of their juvenile justice system involvement. So in order to conduct this study, we selected a sample of 12 states that represent the geography and the diversity in all respects of the United States. And then we did a comprehensive review of not just juvenile justice statute, but collateral consequences confusingly show up in a lot of places. So we looked at education statute and employment statute and occupational licensing and criminal justice statute. In addition, in every state, we reviewed all of the public university post-secondary applications, many of the largest private university applications, as well as community college applications. And we also looked for every state at the largest public and private employers and their employment applications. And then finally, we conducted a set of national focus groups with folks in the juvenile justice system, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, employers, human resource professionals, post-secondary admissions officers, and as Caitlin described, youth and young adults who have been impacted by these collateral consequences. So what did we find? The first key finding, as Caitlin referenced, is most states do have a law that is designed to really distinguish the collateral consequences that are based on a juvenile adjudication compared to a criminal conviction. But there are a lot of reasons why those laws don't actually achieve their intended purpose in actual practice. So first is that the language in a lot of state laws is really vague. It's sometimes collateral consequences are triggered by an adjudication, sometimes a conviction, sometimes a finding of guilt, sometimes a criminal record. And within a state, laws may be inconsistent across juvenile and criminal justice and education and occupational licensing. And so that makes it really difficult for both people affected by the laws as well as the people implementing them to actually understand what the laws are. In addition, every state does in fact have some collateral consequences that are imposed specifically for young people that have juvenile adjudications. Sometimes that's just for young people who commit more serious and violent offenses. Sometimes that's for any offense, but common restrictions include restrictions like law enforcement and other kinds of public safety professions, healthcare professions, which certainly right now is a growing industry that many young people might be barred from as a result of their juvenile record for the rest of their lives. Some states even bar any kind of access to financial aid for someone with a juvenile adjudication. So that could mean an honor student that got into a school fight and the school referred them to the juvenile justice system and they got adjudicated. They might be permanently ineligible for any kind of state-based financial aid just because of that one adjudication. A little bit less transparent is that many states have moral character provisions where essentially occupational licensing boards that control an array of professions, including legal and business and healthcare and trade professions, essentially have broad discretion to restrict people from those occupational licenses if they are deemed to not be of quote unquote good moral character. A few states explicitly restrict those moral character evaluations from including juvenile adjudications, but most states do not, which means that people could be barred from earning these critical credentials, again, just because of a mistake that they committed in their youth. Also, record confidentiality loopholes in many states undermine the intent of limiting collateral consequences. So in most of the studied states, we found that records are generally confidential, but that there were a lot of exceptions. There were exceptions for serious offenses, sometimes for young people that committed and were adjudicated of repeated offenses. And that some states make at least some level of information available to the public on any juvenile adjudication. And so a state could be, great and progressive at limiting these collateral consequences, but could then have poor confidentiality laws that allow young people's records to get out into the public and be used by employers and others for any purpose without being held accountable in any way. Our second key finding was that the majority of post-secondary institutions in the studied states do in fact ask applicants about their criminal history. And while many of the states that we looked at had passed ban-the-box legislation for employers, many employers still do require background checks and explicitly state as such on the application, which can have a similar chilling effect as asking the question itself. So first, applicants to most public colleges, the vast majority of private universities, and even some community colleges have a question not just about criminal history, but on school discipline history. And actually, many of these universities use the common application. And the common application actually made the decision to take off the question about criminal history about 2 years ago. But many colleges and universities added that question back in, which really shows that there's some feelings or some resistance to not having that information, even though there's no research that suggests that asking that question does anything to improve campus safety. Importantly, somebody with a juvenile record has to answer questions about their criminal history without any opportunity to distinguish between a juvenile versus an adult offense, without any opportunity to distinguish the nature of their offense. So that means likely in some of your states, a young person could be adjudicated for a status offense like truancy or running away, and they would have to answer yes to a criminal history question in the same way that someone who committed a violent adult felony would have to. And in answering that question, none of the state applications provided any clear information about how that criminal history information would be used, including whether it was automatically disqualifying. As noted for employment applications, in most states, both public and private employers don't have questions about criminal history for applicants, but many of them did state explicitly on the application that people would have to pass a background check. And as Caitlin discussed a little bit in the focus groups, what folks said is, even if they don't have to answer a question about criminal history, that knowledge of knowing that they would have to pass a background check and feeling like, again, the odds were stacked against them and employers would see even their juvenile records and not give them a fair opportunity stopped many people from even applying to a job in the first place. And so it's really important to consider not just how these applications really limit educational employment opportunities for the people who apply, but the many young people and young adults, and then even adults, that because of their juvenile record never even start a post-secondary application or an employment application because they feel like they're never going to be given a fair shot. Our third key finding was that every state does have some form of juvenile record sealing and expungement laws, but that there are significant exceptions in who is eligible for sealing and expungement, and a lot of limitations about the effectiveness of those processes. So first, in every state, people who commit more serious delinquent offenses and, importantly, repeated offenses may find themselves ineligible for sealing or expungement. So in some states, if you were adjudicated for a trespassing charge, and then a year later you were adjudicated for a minor marijuana possession or some other kind of minor offense, the fact that you were adjudicated twice would make you potentially permanently ineligible for any kind of record clearance, despite the minor nature of those offenses. We also found a lot of procedural challenges. Again, in some states, sealing and expungement is more automatic, at least for certain categories of offenses. But in many states, it's not automatic. And so people have to petition the court for clearance. So the burden is really on them to wade through what can be really challenging administrative processes, legal processes, to figure out what the record clearance process is. In many cases, they have to wait 5, 10, 15 years to do so. So that means an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old, a 20-year-old who's going through that critical transition from youth to adulthood, and that's really looking to transition to independence and find employment opportunities, even if they committed minor offenses, might have to wait to get their record cleared. And that record clearance processes are often not free, that people have to pay hundreds of dollars in order to get their record cleared, which again, particularly for youth and young adults, could be a real burden. And finally, that even after going through all of that process, that the outcome is often determined by a single judge that really has broad discretion. And most states have very little criteria, whether that's related to rehabilitation or restorative justice, for how these kinds of sealing and expungement decisions are made. Perhaps most importantly, sealing and expungement laws are only as effective as people actually know what those laws are and can take advantage of those processes. And in most of the states we looked at, there were no laws that required that young people or their families are made aware of collateral consequences before they admit to a plea deal. And in many cases, they're unaware, even after that adjudication, of the sealing and expungement laws and the processes. And as a result, as Caitlin kind of described, they're often unsure what information that they do need to report, what occupations they are or are not restricted from, what life chances are available to them. And so again, because of the lack of clarity in the law, because of the lack of education processes, too many young people and young adults are transitioning to adulthood and feeling like many of their chances are cut off before they can even start. So what are our recommendations based on this current landscape? The first is to really push for statutory change that really prohibits a wide variety of actors from using juvenile records and juvenile adjudications as the basis for education and employment decisions. And even if you're at the local level or whether you're at the state level, pushing for this kind of policy change is really critical. Because as David talked about a little bit, many of you may be trying to work on the ground to connect young people to different kinds of education and employment programs. But if these statutory barriers continue to exist, then young people are only going to be able to take advantage of those programs and benefit from them so much. So what should those legal changes look like? First is that there really should be no consideration of juvenile records or juvenile adjudications as part of licensing and occupational decisions, including as any part of moral character evaluations. People should not have their juvenile records held against them as part of the consideration to grant them these kinds of critical credentials. Second is that, if it benefits both the individuals and community public safety to connect people with education, and obviously we all know the cost of post-secondary education, then people should not have to face any financial aid restrictions, again, because of mistakes that they made in their youth. It's both to the benefit of the institutions and communities and states to try to promote as much post-secondary access and participation as possible, particularly for people who do have a history of justice involvement. And the last part of this recommendation is really encouraging states to restrict all post-secondary institutions, public, private, 2-year, 4-year, as well as employers from having application questions related to criminal history. If that's too far a reform for some states to go, then at least the ability to distinguish between juvenile and adult offenses. Obviously, we prefer that no justice involvement is held against applicants, but at least employing a developmentally appropriate approach that recognizes that juvenile records should be considered differently than adult records, and certainly a misdemeanor versus a felony, or a person versus other kinds of offenses, and to really only have background checks when it's really directly related to the specific job responsibilities that someone will have to take on. The second recommendation is really importantly to strengthen confidentiality laws so that not just to limit formal collateral consequences, but to make sure records can't informally get into people's hands and be used to restrict or deny educational or employment access. So that importantly means not just restricting court records, but there's lots of records that get generated when a young person comes into contact with the juvenile justice system. So arrest records, court records, other types of records, and those should be restricted for any kinds of employment licensing or post-secondary admissions decisions. It's also important to really look at and try to eliminate most of the automatic exceptions to confidentiality laws. Really, the burden of proof should be on the state or the locale to prove that a young person's record shouldn't be confidential, rather than to presumptively assume that for certain categories of offenses or certain circumstances that the record isn't confidential. And then a sort of small but important point, which is that most background checks, a kind of standard background check, is a FBI background check. And it's really up to states and at state discretion to determine whether they report juvenile records to the FBI and what kind of records and for what kind of offenses. And so if states decide not to report the majority, if not all, juvenile records to the FBI, that means those juvenile records will generally not show up on a standard background check. The third recommendation is if the other two recommendations are implemented, there will be less of a need for robust sealing and expungement laws, but given that some youth will always slip through the cracks, important to really ensure that record clearance processes are universal, that they're automatic, and that they're generally free of charge. So first is that the processes really should be automatic for the vast majority of offenses. They should be timely, so a young person shouldn't have to wait 5 or 10 or 15 years to get their records cleared, but really within 1 or 2 years of reaching the age of majority. And just because you've been adjudicated of an offense more than once, we know that rehabilitation takes time. We know that most young people actually grow out of reoffending and won't reoffend into their adulthood. They should still be eligible for sealing and expungement. If states want to have exceptions for young people that commit more serious or violent offenses, the sealing and expungement process should still be automatic. So there should be an automatically scheduled hearing, again, 1 or 2 years after the age of majority for those individuals, for the court to review the possibility of sealing and expungement. Again, we shouldn't place the burden of record clearance on young people or on young adults. We should make it as easy and automatic as possible for those sealing and expungement hearings to be heard, and for people to automatically participate in them with really much more clearly defined criteria around rehabilitation and restorative justice. The fourth and final recommendation is that people need to know about their rights and obligations. And so we really need to strengthen educational processes related to these laws so people have a better understanding of their education and employment opportunities. So first is whether it's at the state level or local level, but there really should be a requirement that before young people plea, they and their families should be made aware of potential collateral consequences. In many states and many locales, plea deals are extremely common. And youth and their families often don't know of what they're admitting to and the potential short and potentially lifetime collateral consequences that result from those pleas. So there really should be a clear way for whether that's the court or defense attorneys or written information for that information to be provided to youth and families before they have to make that really important decision. In addition, people should have guidance that summarizes what collateral consequences actually apply to them after case closure and clear guidance around the process for sealing and expungement. Again, less than 10% of people actually take advantage of sealing and expungement within 5 years of eligibility. So really, it's incumbent upon the courts and state lawmakers to really make sure that young people and their families are aware of these record clearance processes. And then once people get their record cleared, they still need to understand what information they do or do not need to disclose. Hopefully, best practice in many states is once your record is cleared, you can pretend like that record never existed, but to give people the confidence that they can answer an employment application or a post-secondary application and don't have to say that they have a criminal history. Having that information in writing can help them really be confident about their decisions. So finally, before we turn to some questions and answers, really do want to emphasize that the state statutory and administrative barriers around collateral consequences really should be just part of a broader approach that juvenile justice systems, that probation agencies, that correctional agencies focus on to try to improve economic mobility, equity, and a developmentally appropriate approach for justice-involved youth and young adults. We've done a series of studies, 50 state reviews on the challenges that young people face to getting connected with educational and employment opportunities. And it really exists at the level of both program and practice and of policy. And so there's a lot of work that juvenile justice systems in partnership with workforce development and education systems and community-based organizations need to do to better connect young people with these critical supports and career pathways.
So thank you, Josh. That was very comprehensive, but very well but concise. So appreciate that. So we're going to now kind of turn to questions and answers for our panel. And there's one I already saw. I want to, I guess, directed at Josh. Was a question, if, for example, a child is picked up for shoplifting and the case was diverted to a first-time offender program but never adjudicated, and the case is closed and sealed, this case wouldn't follow the child. Is that correct?
Right. So hopefully not, but it depends on the jurisdiction. So yes, our study looked at collateral consequences that are triggered by an adjudication. So further support for what I know many of you are doing, and certainly what the Annie Casey Foundation has been pushing jurisdictions to do, which is diverting more youth informally, and so that they are not adjudicated. We know from the research that diverting youth versus adjudicating them not only gets you better recidivism reduction outcomes, is more cost effective, but our study is yet another reason why diversion is generally a better approach, because adjudicated youth do face these collateral consequences. That being said, if a youth is arrested, then there is an arrest record. And so you have to look really carefully about, are those records, are they sealed? Are they expunged? Are they both? Can they be made available? Do they show up on a background check? So there's still a lot of questions and minutia about what actually happens with those arrest records, which is why it's important for jurisdictions to explore not just post-arrest diversion, but pre-arrest diversion as well, so that arrest never takes place and that record never even gets generated.
Okay, I see. Just one question was whether or not the PowerPoint slides will be shared or posted somewhere. And Jess, we will be posting both the video of this webinar as well as the PowerPoints will be posted on JDAIconnect, hopefully later today. So the next question is, well, this is a response to the other questions. In Texas, diversion will still come up on many background checks unless they are sealed. So it varies by state. So Caitlin, if you could kind of ask a question about, what are some of your sites done to help youth to overcome some of these barriers, and particularly have they worked with young people around trying to get their records expunged?
Yeah, thank you, David. In our program, the Compass Rose Collaborative that works across 9 states across the nation, there are several things that we have done to help young people to kind of get around some of these barriers. And looking at expungement, like Josh said, a lot of times this falls on, it's the burden of the young person to figure out how this process works, how to get it done. There is a cost associated for filing that. And luckily, like our program, the Compass Rose Collaborative, can assist young people with that. We can connect people to, legal aid or some pro bono legal services and attorneys that want to support young people and assist them. But our expungement rates are actually really low. And I think that mainly is because we've been able to really form some great partnerships to really have employers to look at their hiring policies and kind of promote that culture of second chances and second chance employment. And we've also I think diversion, I'm glad that was brought up because that's a part of our program as well. We accompany young people to court and request that their cases are diverted for participation in some of our workforce and education programs. And that way they have another opportunity to kind of get involved with some of these kind of work and learning programs versus having another sanction through the court.
Thank you. And Josh, can you kind of say a little bit more about how CSG is seeking to promote some of the recommendations that you've outlined? Particularly, I guess, has there been outreach to state legislators and legislatures about these issues? What are you kind of working to do to help promote these changes?
Yeah, good question. So we are currently having discussions with a number of states about doing a more in-depth formal assessment of their collateral consequence laws and supporting state policymakers to look at reforms. We're actually having similar conversations on the adult side as well. And the response has been, actually really robust. I think in many ways, while COVID-19 has created no end of challenges, it's also created some unique opportunities. And I think one of those opportunities is people understanding that a significant priority over the coming year has to be better connecting people with employment and educational opportunities. That unemployment rate that I mentioned for youth and young adults that tends to get hit the hardest and bounce back the slowest. We've also seen a pretty dramatic change in the state budget picture over really just the last few months, where many states went from budget deficits to, as a result of the American Rescue Plan passed by Congress, states now looking at literally billions in dollars going to every state. That on one hand does not have any call out specifically for juvenile and criminal justice, but on the other hand gives states vast discretion over how to spend those dollars. And so this combination of being able to focus at the state level about reducing structural barriers and being able to focus at the state and local level about putting more programs and policies and services in place to connect justice-involved youth and young adults with services, we're seeing policymakers really interested in that work and would encourage now is really a unique moment in time for juvenile justice systems to be more aggressive about reaching out to state policymakers, reaching out to state and local workforce development boards and agencies, reaching out to community-based organizations and initiatives like the work that Caitlin is doing to try to identify partnerships about how to not just advocate for state policy change, but to try to take advantage of some of these resources and develop some critical capacity that could help address these issues long into the future.
And just to sort of a question that came in just a second ago, but I think it relates to, is this, if folks are interested in learning more about what are the barriers in their state, how do they go about learning those? I think your report, covered the 12 states that are included, but how can they learn about the existing barriers that may exist within their states?
Yeah, it's not easy, which is why we were happy that Casey funded us for this project, because they are not transparent. If you only looked at juvenile justice statute, many of these barriers you would not think exist. And that's one of the reasons why one of our recommendations is to create much more clear, comprehensive, overarching statute that works across juvenile, criminal justice, education, occupational licensing. But we're certainly a resource. There's the National Inventory of Collateral Consequences is a public resource that people can use, and it's a national website to try to research collateral consequences. The National Juvenile Defenders Center, the Juvenile Law Center, and others have produced reports on at least some states on collateral consequences and their sealing and expungement laws. So there's definitely resources out there on a number of these issues, but it does require some legislative maneuvering and analysis to really unpack the full set of potential laws and barriers.
So Caitlin, we had a question from a participant who works directly with employers to try to place youth between 16 and 24 into employment. The question was, what are some of the best practices for bridging the gap between employers and previously incarcerated young adults in order to form a collaborative efforts and create a level playing field for the youth re-entering as it pertains to how they react with the employer and vice versa? I think you kind of made reference to that, but you can kind of respond to that question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a very important question. As young people that age, 16 to 24 opportunity youth are entering the workforce, a lot of times this is their first time doing a lot of things. There may be several things that may be a cultural shock to them. They're doing interviews for the first time. And so I really do think that partnering with employers can help bridge that gap. A lot of times employers, they want a pipeline of skilled, trained talent. And if they know that they can help you to kind of bridge that gap, whether it's they can assist what helping develop curriculum, they can talk about some of the skills that are really important for their culture, their job. And if you're directly working with youth, you can help kind of bridge that in designing your program to ensure that young people are trained in some of those skills that the employer needs. That's really attractive to employers. And also, a lot of employers are really concerned about their ability to hire, train, and retain some of these young people who have been impacted by the justice system. So I think, cross-training and really involving the employer in the design of those programs can help kind of bridge that gap and help prepare the young person for the employer and also the employer for the young person.
Okay, we had a question just about the resources. And yes, we all the resources that were mentioned in the chat box or links provided, we also will include those on the page when we post the video and the PowerPoint. So we can expect to see all those resources also. Caitlin, could you also answer, what have some of your sites been doing locally to try to change some of these policies that have, creating barriers to their young people's employment or educational opportunities?
Yeah, I think, fair chance hiring and this kind of second chance employers has been a really common theme across the Compass Rose Collaborative and some of the sites locally, and really having to employers to think differently about their hiring practices and who they hire for these positions. And so I think taking a look at that, but walking alongside employers while they are kind of navigating second chance hiring and really preparing them culturally, I think that is really significant. And that really gets to, I know I'd referenced it before, kind of this cultural shift of hiring young people. And really, employers want to hire the best person for the job. They want to hire good people. They want to retain young people. And so I think really getting some of the data in front of them to show how, a lot of the young people who have been given second chances retain some of these jobs for a really long time. And so employers don't have to think about retraining. But getting this data in front of employers and really walking alongside of them and helping to change those policies, I think is really critical and kind of advancing more opportunities for young people.
Thank you. Okay, so we're kind of running out on time. Is there any final comment that either you'd like to kind of share before we close up this webinar?
Go ahead, Caitlin.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I see in the chat box, people are saying to bring employers to the table. And I just wanted to emphasize really including the young people in the design and some of the approaches that you were doing. Again, some of our Compass Rose collaborative participants were interviewed as for part of this brief focus group, but you can really get some great insight from the young people themselves in the design. So really including them in that human-centered approach, I think is so critical to all programs.
And I guess I just want to reinforce what a key moment in time this really is right now. In past surveys that we've done with the juvenile justice system, folks have really reported a disconnect between the juvenile justice system and the workforce development system and the education system. And often that can come down to resources, but states are in a resource-rich environment right now. And so now really is the time for juvenile justice systems to be thinking about what is our strategy and approach to not just recidivism reduction or not just implementing the court orders, but trying to position youth and young adults on the pathway to education and employment success in the long term. And this is really a great opportunity to be developing partnerships and together trying to be leverage resources to really support the implementation of that strategy.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank both Caitlin and Josh. Really appreciate your participation, and all of you who've joined us today. Thank you for joining us. As mentioned, all the materials, the video, the PowerPoint, and the links will be provided on JDAIconnect. And also, if you need to know whether your state is amongst the 12 that was looked at, you can look at the report to determine that and get more information if your state is among the 12. But with that, I'm going